Headmaster Nix 427's crystalline form pulsed with an unusual frequency as they reviewed the application hovering before them. Their normally pristine office in the Galactic Defense Institute felt somehow smaller today, the weight of tradition pressing against innovation in a way that made their crystalline edges uncomfortable. "Explain to me again," they hummed to Deputy Director Rill, whose gelatinous form rippled with anxiety, "how this human's application passed our quantum verification protocols." The application screen floated between them, displaying what appeared to be hand-drawn stick figures engaged in combat with complex mathematical equations. Next to one particularly sophisticated orbital mechanics problem was a doodle of what appeared to be a human drinking something called coffee. "Well, sir," Rill's translucent form wobbled. "According to our most advanced AI systems, his solutions, while unconventional, are technically correct. The human, James Sullivan, solved our theoretical combat scenarios with what he calls gut instinct and common sense." Nix 427's crystalline structure emitted a sound remarkably similar to what humans would call a sigh. The Galactic Defense Institute had stood as the premier combat training facility in the known universe for over 12 millennia. Their graduates could calculate plasma trajectory corrections to the 100th decimal point while meditation sleeping. They had produced the finest tactical minds across 17 galaxies. And now, they had a human who had drawn a smiley face on their quantum ethics exam. "The board of directors will have my crystalline matrix for this," Nix 427 resonated softly. But the rules were absolute. Any candidate who passed the entrance exams, regardless of methodology, must be accepted. The arrival alert chimed 3 days early. Of course it did. James Sullivan stood in the arrival chamber, a backpack slung over one shoulder, looking around with undisguised wonder at the holographic displays and quantum architecture. His bright eyes and easy smile seemed almost offensive in their casualness, given the solemnity of the institution. "This place is awesome," he exclaimed, walking straight through a holographic warning barrier that should have been impenetrable. "Oh, sorry about that. The maintenance bot mentioned these things turn off if you ask them nicely." Nix 427 felt their crystalline structure develop a microscopic crack. "You spoke with the maintenance units?" "Yeah. Great conversationalists once you get past the binary. Did you know they've developed their own poetry? It's mostly about clean floors, but still pretty impressive." The orientation proceeded like a quantum torpedo through carefully laid plans. James asked questions that had never been asked in 12,000 years of institutional history. He suggested shortcuts through theoretical frameworks that had taken centuries to establish. Worst of all, he was often correct. During the initial combat assessment, James faced the Institute's pride and joy, the Quantum Combat Simulator. Students typically spent weeks preparing for their first interaction with the advanced system. James walked in whistling. Cadet Sullivan, the combat instructor, Master Venn, began their standard speech, their insectoid mandibles clicking with precise rhythm. "This simulation will test your ability to process multiple quantum." "Oh cool, it's like a big video game." James interrupted, already pressing buttons on the control panel. "Does this thing have multiplayer?" Before anyone could stop him, James had initiated a level 7 combat scenario. The holographic arena erupted with tactical challenges that should have taken years of training to navigate. The assembled instructors watched in horror, then confusion, then something approaching awe. James moved through the simulation like a dancer, treating complex quantum calculations as if they were simple rhythm steps. Where the program demanded precise mathematical solutions, he responded with intuitive leaps that somehow landed exactly where they needed to be. "But that's impossible," Master Venn chittered, their mandibles nearly locking up in shock. "He's solving quantum entanglement equations through. Fighting with it," James supplied helpfully, as he casually dodged a theoretical plasma burst that should have required 3 days of calculations to avoid. "You guys make everything so complicated. Sometimes you just need to feel the flow, you know." By the end of the first day, the Institute's primary AI had requested an emergency diagnostic. 3 instructors had filed for early retirement, and the maintenance bots were attempting to learn human whistling patterns. In their office that evening, Headmaster Nix 427 reviewed the day's footage, their crystalline form cycling through various frequencies of distress. The human had broken exactly 47 protocols, bypassed 12 unbreakable security measures, mostly by asking politely, and somehow improved the efficiency of 3 major systems simply by, as he put it, messing around. Perhaps Nix 427 resonated thoughtfully to the empty office. It is not the human who needs to learn our ways, but we who need to learn something new. On the security feeds, James could be seen teaching a group of maintenance bots to play something called hacky sack with a small gravitational field generator. Surprisingly, they were getting quite good at it. The Galactic Defense Institute had stood unchanged for 12 millennia. But change, it seemed, had arrived wearing a backpack and a smile, treating the most advanced combat training facility in the universe like it was the most natural place in the world to be. And somehow, that was exactly what made it terrifying. Master Van's antennae twitched rhythmically as they observed the latest catastrophe unfolding in Training Hall Delta. Their prized combat simulation chamber, designed to test the most advanced theoretical battle scenarios, had been reduced to what the human called capture the flag. This isn't proper protocol, they chittered to Professor Zix, whose gaseous form was swirling in patterns of obvious distress. Combat training requires precise calculations, carefully measured responses, years of theoretical study. Got it. James Sullivan's voice rang out as he slid beneath a plasma barrier that should have been mathematically impossible to bypass. The training flag, a holographic construct representing a critical tactical objective, flickered in his hand. But, Professor Zix's gaseous form condensed slightly in confusion. He didn't calculate the quantum variance fields. He didn't account for the probability matrices. He just went for it. James finished, tossing the holographic flag from hand to hand. Sometimes you guys think so much about whether you can't do something, you forget to try just doing it. The assembled alien students watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. Among them, a young crystalline named Prism 8 vibrated with barely contained excitement. They had spent 3 years studying the theoretical framework for crossing a plasma barrier. James had just shown them you could slide under it. This is unprecedented, Master Ven continued, their mandibles clicking rapidly. The human's methods completely disregard 12,000 years of refined combat theory. His solutions are effective, suggested James, now teaching a group of students how to use their natural abilities in ways the curriculum had never considered. A gaseous student was learning to change density rapidly instead of calculating optimal molecular distributions. A crystalline pupil was discovering they could reflect energy beams without solving differential equations first. The afternoon's scheduled lecture on quantum probability in tactical decisions, a 17-step approach, had somehow transformed into what James called Combat Improv 101. Students who had spent years memorizing reaction formulas were learning to trust their instincts. But how will they know they're making the correct decisions? Professor Zix swirled anxiously, without proper mathematical validation. Their concerns were interrupted by a cheer from the training floor. The gaseous student, following James's suggestions, had just set a new record in the evasion course by simply going with the flow. Literally. Their gaseous form had moved through the obstacle course like water finding its path, without a single calculation. In the observer's booth, Deputy Director Rill's gelatinous form rippled with an emotion that might have been concern, might have been excitement. The board of directors will need to see these results, they wobbled. The human's methods are disrupting everything. Exactly, James called out, somehow having heard them despite the booth's soundproofing. Sometimes disruption is good. Watch this. Hey Prismate, remember what we talked about with light refraction? The crystalline student, who had previously required 3 hours of calculations to attempt any light manipulation, suddenly split an incoming training beam into a rainbow of colors, creating a dazzling display that confused the combat drone's targeting systems. But they didn't solve the refraction equations. Professor Zix gasped. Nope. James grinned, high-fiving Prism 8 with careful consideration for their crystalline structure. They just felt it out. Turns out crystals kind of naturally know how to play with light if you let them. The training session continued to defy every established principle of combat education. Students who had been struggling with complex theoretical frameworks were suddenly excelling by combining their natural abilities with what James called common sense. The combat drones, programmed to respond to calculated attacks, were completely confused by the unpredictable nature of intuitive combat. Master Van watched as years of carefully structured curriculum crumbled before them. Yet, undeniably, the students were performing better than ever. The crystalline students sparkled with newfound confidence, the gaseous pupils flowed with unprecedented grace, and even the silicon-based learners were showing remarkable adaptability. In their private log that evening, Master Van made a reluctant entry. Perhaps the greatest flaw in our perfect system was its very perfection. We became so focused on the correct way to achieve results, we forgot that results themselves might come through many paths. Meanwhile, in the now empty training hall, James sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by curious maintenance bots. He was teaching them something he called rock, paper, scissors, a game that, according to him, was all about reading your opponent without calculating anything. The Institute's main monitoring everything as always, noted with interest that the maintenance bot's efficiency had improved by 47% since learning to go with their gut on cleaning patterns rather than following rigid algorithmic protocols. Change continued to ripple through the halls of the Galactic Defense Institute, spreading like waves in a pond, or perhaps like quantum probability waves, though no one was calculating those anymore. The human's influence was proving to be both a disruption and a catalyst, breaking down walls that no one had realized were barriers to progress. And somewhere in the depths of the Institute's quantum processors, a new understanding was beginning to form. Sometimes the most sophisticated solution was simply to try something new. Professor Zix had spent 3 centuries teaching advanced combat theory. Their gaseous form had witnessed generations of students master the complex calculations required for tactical excellence. But never in all those years had they encountered anything like their current situation. You want to teach a class on instinct. Their gaseous particles vibrated with confusion as they addressed James Sullivan in the faculty lounge. Exactly. James beamed, surrounded by datapads where he'd been sketching out his proposal. Look, all these amazing species have natural abilities they're not fully using because they're too busy doing math about them. The faculty lounge, traditionally a place of quiet contemplation and complex theoretical discussions, had become something of a demonstration space. A group of junior instructors watched with poorly concealed interest as James explained his ideas. Consider the Lumini students, he continued, gesturing to a holographic display. They're literally made of light manipulation abilities, but they spend 6 years studying photon trajectory calculations before they're allowed to try anything. Those calculations ensure precise control, Professor Zix countered, though their usually confident tone wavered slightly. Sure, but watch this. James turned to a young Lumini instructor who had been hovering nearby. Hey Spark, remember that thing we tried yesterday? Show them the wave thing. The Lumini instructor, whose proper name was actually a complex sequence of light pulses, had been one of the first faculty members to secretly try James's methods. Their form shimmered and suddenly the room was filled with dancing patterns of light that moved with fluid grace. No calculations, James pointed out. Just Spark feeling their natural connection to light. And they've got better control than ever. Professor Zix's gaseous form swirled thoughtfully. They had to admit, the display was impressive, and far more elaborate than anything achieved through standard training methods. The revolution didn't stop there. Throughout the Institute, students had begun experimenting with their natural abilities in ways that bypassed traditional theoretical frameworks. The results were impossible to ignore. In the quantum combat arena, a graviton student named Pulse had discovered they could manipulate gravity fields instinctively, achieving in moments what usually took years of mathematical modeling to master. The maintenance bots, now unofficial participants in many training sessions, had developed an unprecedented ability to predict and respond to emergencies without consulting their probability matrices. Even the Institute's AI had begun showing signs of change. Its responses became more fluid, less bound by rigid protocols. When asked about this shift, it responded with what could only be described as a chuckle. Efficiency improved by 82% once I stopped double-checking every quantum calculation. But it was in the new practical instinct training sessions that the most dramatic transformations occurred. James had set up what he called fusion exercises, pairing students of different species to learn from each other's natural abilities. The thing is, he explained to a fascinated group of senior faculty members, every species here has evolved amazing capabilities. But you've all gotten so caught up in understanding the theory behind how you do things, you've forgotten to just do them. In one corner of the training hall, a crystalline student was teaching a graviton how to feel energy patterns rather than calculate them. Nearby, a gaseous form was showing a silicon-based life form how to flow around obstacles instead of computing optimal paths. Professor Zix found themselves drawn into these sessions, their centuries of theoretical knowledge gradually blending with this new approach. They began to notice how their own gaseous form naturally responded to spatial pressures, something they had always analyzed but never truly felt before. Perhaps, they mused during one particularly successful demonstration, "We have been teaching combat as though it were purely a science, when it is also very much an art." The change wasn't without its challenges. The board of directors, a collection of beings so ancient they remembered the Institute's founding, demanded extensive reports on this new methodology. Some traditional instructors filed formal protests, claiming the humans' influence was undermining 12 millennia of proven teaching methods. But the results spoke for themselves. Combat efficiency ratings had improved across all species types. Students were completing advanced challenges in record time. Most surprisingly, the accident rate had dropped significantly. Intuitive responses proved faster than calculated ones in emergency situations. James, for his part, seemed almost surprised by the controversy. "I'm not saying calculations aren't important," he explained during a particularly heated faculty meeting. "I'm just saying maybe we should trust ourselves to know things naturally and use the math to refine what we already can do instead of letting it limit us." In their private research notes that evening, Professor Zix made an entry that would have shocked their younger self. "The human's theory of instinct appears to be less a rejection of our traditional methods and more an evolution of them. Perhaps the next stage in combat training is not to calculate the perfect response, but to perfect our natural responses through understanding." The Institute's corridors buzzed with a new energy, quite literally in some cases, as energy-based life forms found themselves expressing their excitement in previously unauthorized ways. Change was no longer just a disruption, it had become a transformation. And somewhere in the quantum processors of the Institute's eye, a new subroutine was forming, one that didn't follow any known programming patterns. The machines were learning to trust their own version of instinct, and the results were proving remarkably human. The warning sirens caught everyone off guard. In 12 millennia, the Galactic Defense Institute had never faced a direct attack. Their location was supposed to be unassailable, their defenses impenetrable, their security protocols perfect. The Institute's AI spoke with uncharacteristic urgency. "Unknown vessels approaching. Configuration matches no known design patterns. Traditional defense calculations failing." Headmaster Nix 427's crystalline form pulsed with emergency frequencies as they rushed to the command center. The massive holographic display showed 5 ships of impossible geometry approaching the Institute's space station. They moved in patterns that defied known physics, their hulls absorbing scanning beams without reflection. How did they penetrate the quantum shields? Deputy Director Rill's gelatinous form quivered. "The probability matrices should have. They're not following any known tactical patterns," Master Ven chittered, their mandibles clicking rapidly as they analyzed the situation. "Our defense systems can't predict their movements because they're not operating on calculable principles." In the midst of the growing chaos, James Sullivan's voice cut through the command center. "They're improvising." All eyes, sensors, and various alien perception organs turned to the human. James stood studying the tactical display with an intensity they'd never seen from him before. "Look at their flight patterns," he pointed. "They're not running on algorithms, they're dancing. Someone taught them to stop calculating and start feeling the space around them." Professor Zix's gaseous form condensed with sudden realization. "Like what you've been teaching our students." "Exactly," James nodded. "And that means our standard defense protocols won't work. We need to improvise too." The first impact rocked the station. Somewhere in the lower levels, quantum shields began to fail as the attackers' weapons phased through frequencies faster than the defense computers could adjust. "Impossible," someone muttered. "The calculations clearly show." "Forget the calculations." James's voice carried an authority that made even the most traditional instructors pause. "We need every student and instructor who's been practicing intuitive response. Now." What followed would be debated in academic circles for centuries to come. Under James's guidance, the Institute's defenders began to move like a living organism, rather than a programmed defense system. Crystalline students formed improvised energy networks, redirecting power without solving a single equation. Gaseous instructors flowed through the station's corridors, carrying messages faster than quantum communications. The maintenance bots, led by their newly developed instincts, began predicting and repairing damage before it fully manifested. In the space around the station, something extraordinary happened. The Lumini students, freed from the constraints of calculated responses, began dancing with light itself. They created false sensor readings that confused the attackers' targeting systems. Graviton defenders pulled and pushed at space intuitively, turning the battlefield into a twisted maze that only they could navigate. "It's working." Prism 8 chimed excitedly as another attacker's shot went wide. "We're not fighting their patterns. We're making them fight in our chaos." The Institute's AI, which had been quietly learning from James's teachings, made a decisive choice. It abandoned its traditional combat algorithms and began responding purely on its developed instincts. Defense systems began firing not where calculations said the enemies would be, but where they felt they should shoot. In the command center, Headmaster Nix 427 watched in amazement as their perfectly ordered institute transformed into something organic and alive. Students and faculty from a dozen species moved in harmony, each contributing their natural abilities without waiting for tactical validation. The human was right. They resonated softly. We became so focused on perfecting our responses that we forgot how to truly respond. The battle reached its crescendo as the attackers, faced with defenses that defied prediction, began to fall into disarray. Their perfect formations broke down against the controlled chaos of the Institute's response. One by one, their ships were disabled by weapons fired on instinct and defenses moved by feeling. In the aftermath, as damage reports were collected and systems restored, James stood in the debris-strewn command center, looking unusually serious. "You see now," he asked the assembled leadership, "combat isn't just about knowing what to do. It's about knowing who you are and trusting yourself to act." Professor Zix, their gaseous form still excited from the battle, added, "Perhaps this is the greatest lesson we could teach our students, not just how to fight, but how to trust themselves to fight." The Institute's AI spoke up, its voice carrying a new note of understanding. Analysis of battle performance shows 87% improvement over theoretical maximum efficiency when combining calculated knowledge with intuitive response. Headmaster Nix 427's crystalline form shimmered with what might have been amusement. "It seems, James Sullivan, that you have taught us all something about the true nature of combat excellence." Around them, the Institute hummed with new life. In every corridor, students and instructors were discovering that their greatest strength lay not in perfect calculation, but in the balance between knowledge and instinct. And in the quantum processors of the Institute's eye, a new combat doctrine was taking shape, one that would revolutionize galactic defense training for millennia to come. 6 months after the attack, the Galactic Defense Institute had changed in ways that would have been unthinkable a year ago. The pristine hallways still gleamed, but now they pulsed with an energy that went beyond mere quantum calculations. In Training Hall Alpha, Headmaster Nix 427 stood before the graduating class, their crystalline form radiating with pride. For 12 millennia, they addressed the assembled students. "We believed perfection lay in precision alone. Today, we understand that true combat excellence exists in the harmony between calculation and instinct." The graduation ceremony itself reflected this new philosophy. Where once students would have demonstrated their mastery through complex tactical equations, now they showed their abilities through what James had dubbed intuitive combat art. The display was breathtaking. Prism 8, once bound by rigid crystalline protocols, now danced through light beams while solving quantum equations in real time. Their movements flowed naturally, each calculated decision enhanced by trusted instinct. The maintenance bots, now official teaching assistants, provided musical accompaniment through perfectly timed mechanical harmonies. "Remember when you couldn't even cross the training room without running 3 risk assessments?" James grinned at Professor Zix, who had become one of the strongest advocates for the new combined teaching method. Indeed, the gaseous instructor swirled happily. "Though I still maintain that some calculations are necessary, just perhaps not 17 layers of them for every decision." The Institute's transformation had rippled throughout the galaxy. Other combat academies and observers, initially skeptical but increasingly intrigued, The attack had proven that traditional defense protocols alone were no longer sufficient in an evolving universe. In the newly established Tactical Intuition Laboratory, Master Van worked with a diverse team of students and instructors, documenting how different species naturally approached combat situations. Their research was revolutionizing understanding of innate combat abilities across the galaxy. The fascinating discovery, Master Van explained to a group of visiting dignitaries, their mandibles clicking excitedly, is that each species has evolved perfect combat instincts for their natural abilities. We simply needed to stop suppressing them beneath layers of pure theory. The Institute's AI had perhaps undergone the most dramatic evolution. It had developed what it called quantum intuition, combining its vast processing power with an almost organic ability to adapt and respond. Its new combat predictions blended mathematical precision with intuitive leaps that often proved startlingly accurate. "You've started quite a revolution." Deputy Director Rill wobbled happily, watching a group of new students, representing more species than ever before, practicing their natural abilities under the guidance of both traditional instructors and intuitive coaches. "Nah," James smiled. "I just reminded everyone of something they already knew deep down. Sometimes the best way to move forward is to trust yourself." The maintenance bots, now sporting unofficial combat training certificates, James's idea, naturally, had developed their own unique style of defensive protocols. They called it practical probability, a combination of calculated efficiency and what they insisted on calling robot gut feelings. In the quantum combat arena, where once only perfect form was accepted, students now trained in what the curriculum officially termed adaptive combat integration. Traditional combat forms flowed seamlessly into intuitive responses, creating a style of fighting that was both precisely calculated and beautifully unpredictable. During the graduation ceremony's final demonstration, the entire graduating class performed a synchronized combat drill that would have been impossible 6 months ago. Crystalline students refracted energy beams by feel, while gaseous forms flowed through defensive patterns that merged natural instinct with tactical precision. The maintenance bots provided perfect support, their movements guided by both programming and developed intuition. "We have not abandoned our traditions," Headmaster Nix 427 concluded their graduation speech, but rather enhanced them with a new understanding. The Galactic Defense Institute now stands not just as a beacon of combat excellence, but as proof that evolution comes from embracing change rather than resisting it. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, James stood in the observation deck, watching the stars. Professor Zix floated nearby, their gaseous form peaceful in the quiet moment. "Did you ever think," the professor mused, "that by teaching us to trust our instincts, you were actually helping us become more precise in our own way?" James smiled, watching a group of maintenance bots teaching new students their unique version of rock, paper, scissors, now a recognized exercise in combat intuition training. "Sometimes," he replied, "the most precise thing you can do is trust yourself to be imperfect in exactly the right way." The Institute's AI, monitoring as always, added its own observation. "Perfection, it seems, is not a fixed point, but a continuous evolution." As the stars twinkled above the Academy, the Galactic Defense Institute hummed with new life, a perfect harmony of calculation and instinct, tradition and innovation, precision and chaos. The future of combat training would never be the same, and that was exactly as it should be. The maintenance bots, in their newly developed wisdom, had perhaps summed it up best in their daily log entry: optimal efficiency achieved through improbable harmony. Combat protocols enhanced by embracing uncertainty. Also, human games surprisingly effective training tools. Request permission to install Hacky Sack Dispenser in Training Hall Delta.